capacity, that is cranial capacity. And Mendelian inheritance, when you're talking about genetics, genetics is classified into two types. There are two forms in a way: Mendelian and non-Mendelian. Mendelian and non-Mendelian. So Mendelian is talking about the kind of inheritance that is of a specific fashion, and that is given by Gregor John Mendel. That is given by Gregor John Mendel. So that is what we regard as Mendelian genetics, right? So he tells that the law of dominance. That means if there are two genes, and in these two genes, there are two forms of genes. One can be dominant character, and the other is recessive. So this is what Mendelian genetics is talking about, right? In one of the principles, right? There are two forms. That means there are two characteristics: tall and short. And whatever the character that is appearing in the next generation, if the tall person and the short person marries, if the person is tall, this is dominant. And if the person is short, short character becomes dominant, right? In that way, he is telling that either one has to be dominant, one has to be recessive. But gradually, when we are studying genetics, we have understood that there is codominance as well, right? If there is A blood group and B blood group combined together, it is becoming AB rather than A or B. That is called codominance. That is called codominance. All this comes under non-Mendelian genetics. Codominance comes under non-Mendelian, whereas the law of dominance comes under Mendelian genetics. So because of the difference, we have Mendelian type of inheritance, non-Mendelian inheritance. Okay? Okay? The next one, gene flow. Gene flow, right? Gene flow is nothing but how the genes are passing on between the populations, between population. The transfer of genetic material between populations, reducing genetic differences between them, is called gene flow, right? So obviously, when you are seeing northeast as well as the other part of India, northeast India and other part of India. So gradually, if the marriages are happening between Indians and the northeast Indians, don't you think that the characteristics will become minimal gradually and everyone appears the same after few generations? That means the genes are flowing between the different populations, ultimately bringing them into uniformity. That is what we call gene flow, the transfer of genetical material between populations, reducing genetic differences between them, right? So whatever the genetic differences that are there, that will become reduced over time because genes are flowing between different population. If you have seen Africans and Americans in America, so obviously because the genes are flowing from the black and white people together, so obviously now the brown population is increasing, right? And that gradually increases eventually if the same thing happens. So that is what we call gene flow within the population, right? So European settlers arrived in America and gene flow occurred between them, and finally the population is becoming more or less similar, right? There is no difference. So that is gene flow. The next one, genetic drift. Next one is genetic drift. What is genetic drift? Mechanism of evolution that causes random changes in allele frequencies in smaller population. That is what we call genetic drift. That means it is a mechanism of evolution. That means because of the genetic drift, evolution happens, and which causes random changes in allele frequencies in smaller population. That means allele is nothing but the gene. One set of a gene is called allele. One set of a gene is called allele, and because the allele frequency is changing, that means the number of times this appears is changing, right? This particular default gene within the smaller population, right? Because of this, that actually makes genetic drift. So what do you mean by that? Imagine 1,000 people are living in a particular geographical area, and one person who is short has moved from this geographical area to new geographical area, right? And that small population began cultivating. The small population began growing, right? And because of this, right, all the genes which are responsible for this particular character will move, and this becomes a different species. There is a chance that this becomes different species altogether, right? So that is what we call genetic drift. That is what we call genetic drift. So because of the changes in the allele frequencies and within the smaller population, you can actually see that becoming evolved, right? So the founder effect, where the small population splits off from the larger one, resulting in reduced genetic diversity, right? When the smaller population who are short are moving, it is reducing the genetic diversity, and the shorter population might become entirely a new species, right? So maybe during before 10th class you have studied about Darwin and his adventures towards the adventures in the Galapagos Islands, where he brought this theory of natural selection and the survival of the fittest, right? So because the islands are separated and it is an archipelago of islands, the birds which are present in all these areas are ancestrally the same, but because they have been separated, right, they have become a new species altogether. That is what we call genetic drift. That is what we call genetic drift.